Well, thank you, Kathy, for such an impossibly promising introduction. And thank you, Dean Sterling and colleagues at Yale, for this very deep honor of an invitation. It certainly has challenged me to tailor my theology to this moment, to this time, Once upon a time, we had time. Whatever the story of our individual mortalities, there extended out from us all together, the space of a shared time, the time of a shared space. The sharing was fitful. We reached no consensus on the fabric of the future, the texture of its temporal bodies, or the alpha and the omega of its ages. Our calculations collided, our opposed futures warred, left hope drugged or in ruins. But then there was at least a time to rebuild, with space for a more marvelous togetherness. New heaven and earth, utopic horizon, seventh generation, endless rhythm, eternal return, indifferent timeline, or deferred post-apocalypse, or so the stories go. We had time, and now we seem to be running out of it in more ways than one. So I was actually thinking of global warming when I wrote something like that paragraph last summer. I was saying then that if the election went one way, we had a real chance of changing course within the narrow window of time that climate science allots. In case of the other outcome, the window slams shut, I wrote, on the probability of a livable Earth future for human civilization. We would be too busy trying to respond to the immediate threat to vulnerable human populations, undocumented immigrants, Muslims, and African Americans, to organize to protect the Paris agreements, let alone endangered species, except maybe for pink pussycats. But I do not now stand before you to proclaim the window shut. That would perform just the sort of self-fulfilling apocalypse we never need. Having committed to the topic, by bad luck or providence, of political theology of the earth, I find myself just trying to retune, reset, retailor the political, along with the rest of you. The time remaining remains short. It already was. Really just, I am quoting 1 Corinthians 7:29. The appointed time is short. Surely Paul did not mean by short 2,000 years, nor was he making an appointment with climate catastrophe. But I did need to make an appointment with Paul, and that is still no easy thing for a feminist theologian with the entrenched 20th century habit of opposing liberating gospel to sexist, heterosexist, supersessionist, dualist epistle, 1 Corinthians in particular. Nonetheless, it's a different century, and I need ancestral help, a certain backwards depth to time that somehow slows it down. And lo, what did I find? But that the NRSV's translation, the appointed time is short, misleads on 2 counts. The Greek word translated short is far more complicated, in fact, more inviting, more political. Sunastelemnos. It means gathered together, contracted. It was from the political philosopher Agamben in his meditation on Paul that I got this clue. But then also the appointed time really means remaining, and maybe syntactically simply misplaced in that part of the sentence. In other words, Paul is not announcing some predetermined end of the timeline or programming an appointment with the second coming. The time is not the chronos that can be aligned and calculated, but the now time of the kairos. The time is contracted, but his point was not to menace his community with the end, but on the contrary, as he says just 3 verses later, for the present schema, form, order, schematism, the present schema of this world is passing away, and I want you to be without care, unafraid, no matter what. So in that spirit and in this time, we may contemplate together a political theology of the earth. Not, let me reassure you, as the theology of a macro subject called the earth, who might finally step up and do our theology for us, but of a subset of earth dwellers who willy-nilly must learn to speak up planetarily for the non-human planet and for its human multitudes. Today we struggle with what the political, and I mean tonight, with what the political might mean in such a theology. Tomorrow we can focus on that theopolitically charged earth, and Thursday, more systematically, or as Benjamin Valentin would say, cartographically, on its Christian theology as it gathers itself, contracts in this moment. The political means, first, the gathered, the contracted as polis, city. Of course, at Yale, we cannot forget Wayne Meek's first urban Christians. We know that Christianity, since its urbanization by Paul, has always been political. It dispersed its theopolitics across the oikumene of the earth. If that earth oikos is now being turned by its urban elites into a planet of slums and dumps, no heirs of the Second Testament can ignore the economics and the ecologies of the polis, Whore of Babylon, New Jerusalem, or pullulating ambiguity. Oicumenically, oikologically, oikonomically, theology in this oikos is always already political. And according to what is called political theology, politics is always already theological. So many of you will recognize the following oft-cited postulate. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. 1921, Political Theology by the German legal theorist Carl Schmidt. I am considering the political in relation to political theology, which is not, first of all, a branch of theology. It has served largely as a discursive tool passed among recently postmodern philosophers of the left, from Agamben to Zizek in this century. The phrase, however, had been claimed by theologians of the post-Holocaust German left starting half a century ago, when Metz, Moltmann, and Zolle freed it from the Nazi association with which Schmidt had tainted it. But political theology seems to have sounded too generic, too Eurocentric to catch on for the rest of the 20th century. It seemed to dilute the liberation, feminist, black, ecological, or sexual particularities of the Christian left. But I am not having recourse to political theology in order to try to disentangle from identity politics. I am hoping instead for a de-essentialized, dense, indeed contracted entanglement of our differences, kin to what Moltmann recently has called the solidarity of hope. Since Schmidt has provoked a new wave of secular interest in theology, his view of the political may be illuminating, and at this moment, attention to one who put his genius at the disposal of a fascist state may also help us to think the unthinkable that we are this year trying to think. For Schmidt, the political is concerned with the formation of a we, and is therefore focused on the construction of collective identities. However, as these collective identities are formed through conflict and antagonism, according to him, they are the result not of free discussion, but of decision and exclusion. In this context, as Schmidt notes, A group of people only become a unified and coherent subject to the extent that they share a common enemy. Now, it's easy, isn't it, to read this definition of politics in terms of friend versus foe as itself the foe. We, for instance, friendly Christian liberals and progressives, wants amity, not enmity. Love trumps hate. Those signs sprouted in my seminary hall on November 9th. But can we deny that this hate is concentrated in one we do consider our enemy, and that we hope that enmity will join a critical mass of us against him? Love my enemies. Oh, yes. But that doesn't mean they aren't enemies. For Schmidt, the enemy is defined as the other, the stranger, and it is sufficient for his nature that he is in a specifically intense way, existentially something different and alien. So you see how in the 30s, Schmidt could support the production of the Jew as unifying enemy. If the political collective comes down to identity, the religio-racialization of its other is the most effective means to essentialize both the we and the enemy. So, how would we then avoid mirroring the very oppositionalism of our foe-producing foes? If we avoid antagonism, don't we fall back upon a disempowering civility spliced with the habits of the liberal rationalism, which Schmidt, not without reason, deemed a failure in the Weimar 20s? The political theorist Chantal Mouffe suggests a third way, beyond mere antagonism and liberal consensualism. She calls it agonism, the word which means struggle. Taking seriously Schmidt's critique of the liberal political expectation of rational consensus, she argues that a healthy democratic process calls for a vibrant clash of political positions and an open conflict of interests. If such a clash is missing, it can too easily be replaced by a confrontation between non-negotiable moral values and essentialist identities. Similarly, the political philosopher William Connolly names as key to a working democracy the practice of agonistic respect. It resists the resentment, religious or economic, that fuels antagonism and its spirit of retaliation. And we may add that agonistic respect does not erase the agonies routinely inflicted by systemic antagonism, its violence, and its greeds. The refusal to agonize together over difference means the repression of the political space in which a vibrant clash of political positions can take place. Therefore, the possibility of a shared good, a common weal, gets defeated in advance. Of course, this is no mere problem of the right, is it? So, I am tempted to define the political, never reducible to politics, quite simply as the struggle for the common good. But only if we hold that commons indissociable from what radical race theory, Harney and Moten, calls the undercommons. The undercommons is a public that has lost hope in politics, but that persists in resistance and in self-organization, and so is hardly apolitical. But more precisely then, we might characterize the political as collective self-organization in the face of critical difference. Collective self-organization in the face of critical difference. Self-organization characterizes the open process in which complex systems emerge, if not from emergency, always at the edge of chaos. The edge of chaos in science, especially the life sciences, refers to a phase transition in emergent systems. Complexity requires order, but not too much of it, in evolutionary as well as in revolutionary process. So this is one reason for a biblical theology of creation, which is always already political, to read Genesis as the self-organizing complexity at the edge of chaos, on the face of the deep. Connolly, in his book, The Fragility of Things, solicits complexity science for political theory in a universe far from equilibrium, nonlinear, and full of irreversible processes, in which he says multiple temporalities and their mutual imbrication suggest a swarming new public. Its politics resembles what my Cloud of the Impossible frames for theology as the complicatio of entangled difference. We inhabit, Connolly writes, an entangled world in which the best hope is to extend and broaden our identities, interests, and ethos of interconnectedness as we multiply the sites of political action. He also evoked here in 2013 Polanyi's 1944 warning in The Great Transformation that neoliberal economics was likely to provoke eventually a new fascism. So then, how shall we broaden our ethos of interconnectedness at this time when time itself seems to be contracting? But maybe the question should be, how can we not? Is our planetary interdependence not precisely a contraction, a complicatio that folds difference not down, but together? Crucial is to recognize that the critical difference of political struggle demands the deep sense of critical, from the Greek krinein, to discern or judge, to decide, as linked to krisis, crisis. Critical difference refers to a crisis in which it is necessary to decide upon action. This is why we gather not just communally, but self-organize politically. Critical difference of perspective, of identity, or of situation creates crisis, big or small, and requires decision. Well, suddenly, we find ourselves under the laconic gaze of Carl Schmidt, who has been waiting to remind us of the other main postulate of political theology. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception, meaning in the emergency. Indeed, the power of the sovereign state is contracted into the person of the leader who decides what is a state of emergency, the lawgiver who may suspend the law. So it is this exceptional power of the sovereign to decide in what he decides is an exceptional crisis that proves the rule of sovereignty itself. And it is precisely here, to the apex of power, that Schmidt nails theology, to the exception. If all modern political concepts are secularized theology, he writes, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent lawgiver. The exception in jurisprudence is the miracle in theology. He then cunningly goes on to paraphrase Kierkegaard this way. The exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing. The exception proves everything. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. Schmidt is mobilizing Kierkegaard against universalism, Hegelian, liberal, or Marxist. But Schmidt fails to mention that Kierkegaard actually goes on in that passage to say that the exception is reconciled in the universal. But I don't want to deny the torpidity of the democratic machine. Thus, one candidate had tweeted on October 16, Dem debate was really boring. But I enjoyed tweeting and got most of the votes. Schmidt's scorn of the liberal banishment of the miracle from theology merges with his mockery of the politics of ewiges Gespräch, everlasting conversation. Some of you guilty of this? And presciently, he blames also the anarchists who see in the patriarchal family and in monogamy the actual state of sin. Too much hermeneutics or too much her undermines the paternal power of the sovereign God, and with him, of the state's capacity to decide in the emergency. That Schmidt found such a sovereign in the Führer suggests where, in the exception, the racial sexual politics of antagonism trends, and suggests that it emanates from the sovereignty of Deus omnipotens. On the latter note, political theology, the book, culminates appealing, in fact, to that moment of decision, to a pure decision, not based on reason and discussion and not justifying itself. That is, to an absolute decision created out of nothingness. End quote. Anything else for him is torpid universalism or anarchy and chaos. Well, a Schmittian political theology will brook no hermeneutics of creation from the chaos, the Hebrew tehom. Indeed, no straight creation by omnipotent fiat ex nihilo, whatever its politics, will tolerate the counter-doctrine I had dubbed creatio ex profundis. Nonetheless, if we borrow Schmidt's recognition of the ongoing operation of theological motifs in secularized form, we locate a transdisciplinary backdoor by which Christian theology today may enter a wide political conversation, sometimes called post-secular. This does not commit us to his nostalgia for theocracy or to its exceptionalist form of omnipotence. Let us note that his monarchical sovereignty is recognizable early in Christianity, at least as early as the 4th century Eusebius, Constantine's house theologian. And surely, Eusebius writes, monarchy far transcends every other constitution and form of government, for that democratic equality of power, which is its opposite, may rather be decried as anarchy and disorder. Eusebius mobilizes the unifying force of monotheism against all multiplicity and democratic equality. He was no more enthusiastic a Trinitarian, by the way, than was his defender, Schmidt. Thursday, we will consider the theologic of the sovereign exception enthroned as the omnipotent rule of the world. Tonight, let us turn to a series of political exceptionalisms, secularized, right at the heart, ironically, of our democracy. So for this, I depend upon the genealogy of American exceptionalism offered by Kelly Brown Douglas in Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. In an effort to establish the antiquity of the Church of England, Brown Douglas, an Episcopalian, writes, Archbishop Matthew Parker encouraged research into the history and politics of Anglo-Saxons. For 2 centuries, this research centered in a reading of Tacitus on the manners of the Germans, describing the blue-eyed tribes which the English claimed as their ancestors. It also nourished participatory governance. According to Tacitus, within the various tribes, the whole tribe deliberated upon all important matters, and most final decisions rest with the people. The description of this proto-democratic self-organization stimulated such radical experiments as the Levelers, the Puritans, the Pilgrims. The Anglo-Saxon myth came to America through the radical English reformers as the new Israelites in God's plan. They consider themselves the Anglo-Saxon remnant, writes Kelly Brown Douglas, that was continuing a divine mission traced beyond the woods of Germany to the Bible. The moment, the kairos of Exodus stirred, as it did in all the radical movements of Europe, the politics of the new polis, new self-organization across an ocean of critical difference. But having settled firmly along the coast of the New World, Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism soon shifts toward an overt and secularized racism. Benjamin Franklin would write that all peoples are black or tawny, even the Germans, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English, he says, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. And he continues, I could wish their numbers were increased. And while we are scouring our planet by clearing America of woods, and so making this side of our globe reflect a brighter light to the eyes of inhabitants in Mars or Venus, why should we, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America? So yes, this extraplanetary whimsy is offering a racist logic for opposing the transatlantic slave trade. A political theology of the earth reads also the eco-racial takeout of this dream of a bright and shining nation stripped at once of dark woods and dark people. The narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism is America's exceptionalism, claims Brown Douglas. The challenge to national unity then became the multiplicity of other immigrant stocks. The challenge was felt as emergency by the late 19th century. President Theodore Roosevelt feared race suicide. It was, she shows, the construction of whiteness that worked to resolve the contradiction between America's Anglo-Saxon and immigrant identity. Whiteness signified that the immigrants were Anglo-Saxon enough. In other words, a versatile religiopolitics of race fuels the secularized galvanizations of a we versus a they, a we to be taken out, unitary, purified of the dark taint of multiplicity. But J. Cameron Carter, in Race, a Theological Account, shows that actually it is first the European racialization of the Jew that reorganizes the human in terms of race. The race machine is from the start a modernization of the Christian supersessionism that takes something called Christianity out of its Judaism, someone called Jesus out of his Jewish body, something called Christos out of its messianicity. Note, by the way, that exception comes from excipere, the Latin for to take out. Note also that the take-out exceptionalism works at once to take the sovereign out of the law as above it and to take the religio-racial other out of the we as beneath the law. In his analysis of race and political theology, J. Carter exposes how the constitution of the white masculine as imperial man was tied to his assuming a messianic and mediatory role in the world. As imperial savior, he is sanctioned by divine right. However, one should not mistake the takeout of the anti-racist analysis as a call to take the messianic signifier out of play. Far from it, only to take out its whited out version. So back on the front of continental anti-immigrant politics, Giorgio Agamben's deployment of Schmidt provoked his own return, Agamben's own return to the Pauline Messiah. Agamben is actually my favorite among all the leftist philosophers who have discovered both political theology and Paul. Yes, you can call it political theology. Agamben engages Paul by way of such leading Jewish thinkers of the period of World War II as Walter Benjamin and Jakob Taubes in their complicated engagement with Schmidt and with Paul. Agamben starkly distinguishes Paul's sublation of the law as a fulfillment, pleroma of the law, from the state of exception which indefinitely suspends the law. So Agamben was then provoked by the US Patriot Act, 2001, to write, 2 years later it comes out here, the state of exception. The state of exception, he writes, not only appears increasingly as technique of government rather than an exceptional measure, but it also let its own nature as the constitutive paradigm of the juridical order come to light. So reflecting on the routine violations of international law regarding torture and imprisonment, he concludes that the state of exception has today reached its maximum worldwide deployment. Sounds a little hyperbolic for 2003, but hang in. He writes, now, then the normative aspect of law can thus be obliterated and contradicted by a governmental violence that, while ignoring international law externally and producing a permanent state of exception internally, nevertheless still claims to be applying the law. Contemplating Schmidt's figure of rule by suspension of the rules, Agamben warns against the collapse of the distinction of two powers into each other, the one, potestas, as normative and juridical, the other, auctoritas, as anomic and meta-juridical, an authority emanating from the personality of the leader. When these two fuse in one person, he warns, the juridico-political system transforms itself into a killing machine. So he writes, to try to interrupt the working of the machine that is leading the West toward global civil war is to separate these forces. Agamben is here summoning Walter Benjamin, who wrote of fascism that the state of exception had become the rule. So, what now? An essay posted in December on the blog Lawfare by legal theorist Quinta Juracek helps. Primarily thinking of Agamben, she analyzes the nightmares of those who thought they saw Schmidt in the form of George W. Bush. Certainly, she says, the Bush administration saw an intentional turn towards an aggressive view of executive power. But the fundamental structure of the rule of law itself remained standing, if resentfully. So did Agamben cry wolf, she asks. Our new president-elect now poses an interesting problem for the Schmittian revival. Have we now, 8 years after Bush left office, elected our first Schmittian president? The crucial bit of that Aesop fable about the boy who cried wolf, after all, is that the wolf actually does show up at the end. So is Trump the Schmittian wolf that Bush was not? End of quote. About the current US leadership's interest in a state of exception or in international or constitutional law at all, we are learning as fast as the little boy's sheep. But from the start, the candidate was characterized, whether in admiration or dismay, as one who does not play by the rules, hence the aura of exceptional authority. Agamben's auctoritas recalls Max Weber's concept of the charismatic leader. Weber contrasts the charismatic to the traditional, conservative, and the bureaucratic, often liberal styles of leadership. In terms of the temporalities of sovereignty, we could say that the traditional leadership repeats a normative past, whereas liberal institutions presume a homogeneous time of modern progress. The charismatic, however, leads from an intense present tense, a now time that ruptures the homogeneity of chronos. The religious aura of charisma from the word grace is, of course, hard to miss. However, it gets vulgarized. The charisma, of course, can go in very opposite directions. It enables the exceptionalism of the sovereign in the fusion of auctoritas and potestas that yields the popular strongman and the killing machine. Or charisma can signify, in Weber's example, the gifts of a St. Francis. More recently, Gandhi, king. On the one hand, the sovereign charisma of the bully. On the other, the messianic charisma of love. Two different deities, two different secularizations. The messianic charisma does not compete with the potestas of its antagonists. It practices not a pacifying acquiescence, often confused with forgiveness either, but rather what I want to call an amorous agonism. It lacks potestas, but it claims authority. It is gifted with what Benjamin, on the verge of his death in the attempt to flee the fascists, says every generation has been endowed with: a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. It solicits the backward gaze of his Paul Klee, angel of history, contemplating in horror the unredeemed losses, the camps, the lynchings. That weak power has, of course, also been encoded as the cross, which endlessly recalls an agony that is never erased, though it may be systematically forgotten. In fact, the cross performs a double coding of both the sovereign antagonism and the agonistic agape, the opposed world schemas intersecting, the one inspiring a long history of struggles for the basileia tu theou, the kingdom of the least, and above him hanging the sign, the King of the Jews, the sovereign ridicule of the messianic promise. Of course, the ultimate mockery came later, when imperial irony posed as the church's truth. We might then distinguish between the ongoing effects of two histories, two great currents of secularization, two political theologies, that of the sovereign omnipotence and that of the messianic commons. One might read against Schmidt, then his contemporary Ernst Bloch, who discerns the biblical eschatologies, earthly apocalypses, and Christian social utopias as the source of all Western revolutions. Indeed, the source of what he calls hope. His influence on Jürgen Moltmann forms a messianic pathway for political theology. His influence on Munoz in Cruising Utopia, quite another, with its queering of hope. And indeed, without a queer multiplicity of love strategies resisting the normativity of that manly potestas, not through what Jasper Puhor calls a sexual exceptionalism, what hope for an amorous agonism can there be? The whole history of collective struggles for justice, divergently secularized in the breakthrough moments of resistance, revolution, satyagraha, civil rights, social movements, poses an alternative political history with its own charismatic now times, alternative to that sovereign state power, and yet sometimes breaking through to shift that power toward the common good. So if sovereignty has now managed a fusion of potestas and auctoritas, it lacks the dignity of the Latin, but it has the power of a hyper-Caesar. But let us remember that the exception takes itself out. We wonder, what can we in the collective of religious thinkers and leaders do to help it really get out? Time is contracting, but crisis need not reduce our critical difference to antagonism. What we are unconditionally against need not define us, even when it gathers us. We can yet twist emergency into the agonism of a new public. It emerges even now, as we experienced, and I imagine many of you in person, in the January 21 marches. Something fierce, fresh, promising, a charisma of self-organization at the edge of chaos. So might theological folk help now to call forth an immense commons of amorous agonism? Not that we will be or deliver the Messiah. Our struggle will not wait for a charismatic exception. But might it take in the grace of a messianic inception? Still, at this moment, such hope does strain against the impossible. Poisons of racialized, sexualized, financialized, Americanized neo-fascism, is that the word, are penetrating our common world, our collapsing schema. But when was the biblical notion of hope merely possible? When was honest hope mistakable for optimism? May we remind each other that what confronts us now as impossible might crack like a broken hallelujah into unforeseen possibilities in a moment. That would be the moment of the kairos, the messianic now time that Agamben so nimbly traced through Benjamin's hidden Paulinism of the kairos. History, writes Benjamin, is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now, the jetzt site, now time. He found, as a Marxist, that the homogeneity had, in its absorption, had gotten absorbed through a Marxist view of inevitable progress and then betrayed the working class struggle in Germany. So he opposes to modern temporality, capitalist or Marxist, the Jetztzeit, Honun Kairos. The Jews, he writes, did not investigate the future, but neither was the future turned into homogeneous, empty time. And now his last sentence. For every second of time was the narrow gate through which the Messiah might enter. And that's precisely the moment of what he calls the ungeheure Abbreviatur, the monstrous abbreviation, a recapitulation or messianic crystallization. It contracts an immense history into itself. So do you hear the echo of the Pauline sunestalemnos, the contraction of time itself? But imagine the pressure of that crystallization. I mean, feel it now. As each of you gathers this historical moment in its agony, its agonism, into yourself, and so into the present of the complex, personal, planetary history that makes each one of you up. To be concrete, there are tensions, contradictions that pressure this moment, that do not shorten it so much as they contract it, squeeze it, press intractable difference, opposing demands into itself. Binaries that can form a we against an enemy, and yet that may helpfully complicate a democratically pluralist, justice-seeking we. So, practical example, 1. Do we give our gifts to social movements on the streets? Yes, but, and when do we engage electoral politics, investing in democratic rebirth, discerning who among us might have the charism for such institutional struggle? Example 2. How do we intensify the struggle for populations now at risk? Amp up the volume on Black Lives Matter, or on reproductive freedom, or on sanctuary for immigrants, on climate? Do we choose one issue and double down? Or shall we instead work for the broad coalition that might actually work in a struggle for the common good, common enough to take in the undercommons, those who have been taken out, and maybe on its other side, those who want to take us out? Example 3, as to the politics of theology and the theology of politics. Given the growing secularism of the Democratic Party, and given that, say, the civil rights movement, civil rights period, is inconceivable without MLK's religious language, when do we use Christian language as a witness and a weapon against political evil? And when do we exercise democratic coalitional care as to ecumenical, interfaith, intercultural, and secular language? Do we abandon the language of religious morality to the religious right and its atheist president? Or do we rev up our prophetic, gospel, and epistolary language with its ancient entanglements, both sovereign and messianic? When confronted with the crises of collecting ourselves as a public, must we answer such internal questions with a simple decision, one side or the other? Don't we then forfeit the possibility offered in the monstrous contraction of the political present? Well, a theological clue blows in from the 15th century. What if we absorb here the political form of the coincidentia oppositorum, Nicholas of Cusa's apophatic response to intractable contradictions that unhinge our white shining certainties? But once, those tensions pressed him into what he called the dark cloud of the impossible. And once inside it, possibility appears. What he called the gate of paradise cracks open. Just when the window of time appeared to be slamming shut, this is perhaps related to Benjamin's narrow gate, where, as he says of the now moment, something flashes up. A final hint tonight from Paul. The messianic contraction of time in 1 Corinthians 7 is replicated in 1 Ephesians 1:10. The recapitulation of all things in Christu, in the Messiah, who embodies the God of the Paul of Acts, in whom all things live and breathe, all things without exception. So in the monstrous abbreviation, our contracted density of world can be lived without fear. We are here folded into one another, members one of another, as all things become enfolded in an amorous embodiment. No matter what, it all matters. Its matter matters. More on that tomorrow. So a political theology of the earth will not press to make secular politics religious. The religious right rode that trajectory through to what looks oddly like its own secularization. But I think we will resist any repression of the theological histories, worrisome or worthy, that haunt our struggles for a good common to all the populations of the planet. And we discern among those theological specters possibilities for our own time, for the actual oikos, economy, ecology, ecumenics of our Genesis collective. In the sunestalemnos, the ingathering of that possibility, we are not taken out to some exceptionalist heaven or hell, but rather taken in, all in. Far from any exceptionalist anti-universal, we might conclude, as does Professor Tanner in The Economy of Grace, holding out, she says, the theological vision of a universally inclusive community of mutual benefit as our moral compass. The charisma of that commons comes as a gift of courage before the onslaught of a new sovereign exception. Take heart. That's what courage is. The collective inception is collecting itself. Its grace flashes up. It empowers the self-organization, the crystallization of a new public, a we enfleshed in those marches already, a people able in this moment of contraction to burst out into an immense struggle, no matter what. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think all of us now fully appreciate the introduction and her poetic gifts as well as the profundity of her thought. The floor is now open for questions. I ask two things. Would you please identify yourself when I call on you? And secondly, would you make sure that you disguise your comment as a question? We have a mic, so you can be heard. Thank you.
I'm just a layman. Eugene Connolly, Yale, 1953. Are you and I responsible now to create this new current Messiah?
Great question. We can't create the Messiah, but we might together co-create a new public, and we might co-create that new public as a messianic collective, right? So we might be inspired by the grace of that messianic flashing up that Benjamin talks about, but that's a grace. It's given to us. We don't create it. It lets us create. It might inspire us to create that public as a messianic public, but never as the Messiah.
Takes some courage.
Yes, right. We're working on that, aren't we? It always helps me. Since I easily do the Christian love wimp out thing, it really helps me to remember that the word courage comes from, from the French, cœur, heart. So taking heart, yeah, so the feeling of love that I think we tune to for comfort and for closeness and for intimate meaning is able also to fuel that courage. I think that's what
It's happening in
Christos
the
means. It is,
every
isn't
day,
it?
isn't it?
It is, isn't it? And it might not have been. We might not have seen that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, Lynn?
Lynn Todd said, thank you for that, Catherine. I'm wondering if you could say, I am so attached to this vision of the shortness of the present time, allowing us not to be afraid, right? This present schema is passing away, and I want you to be without care, unafraid, courageous. How do we hold on to the shortness of time without intensification of crisis? Or is this another entanglement where we can't, in a way, have one without the other? I want both the theological, apocalyptic, if you will, and the political answer to that. So please help.
But your answer would be yes, right? I mean, right, I think that Paul is addressing a sense of crisis and imminently more crisis to come in whatever form that was anticipated. It's the Roman Empire coming down, etc. And so what's so appealing about that imagery, isn't it, that it ministers to that shortness of breath we feel in the shortness of time. We feel it closing in on us. And if we've been tuned to climate science, we've been feeling it for a while. We've been feeling it with our species self. And now something much more rapid and dramatic that can't be postponed for a few more years is causing that shortness of breath, that shortness of time. So I just found it so restorative to enter into the syntalennos, this contracted complexity of the moment that seems to be suggested by the Pauline Kairos, that it's precisely, it seems, in facing the fear, in entering into the moment with all of its crisis, that we catch our breath. I'd like to quote the end of God Indifferent, something about that that breath, that hot breath, hot sensuous breath of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, there's an amorous entanglement there. So that there's that catching of the breath, the pneuma, the ruach, that seems to open emergency into a site of emergence. It doesn't guarantee that catastrophe is going to be turned into catalyst. That's my bumper sticker. Not that it won't guarantee it, but just plain catastrophe into catalyst. There's no guarantee. Not in this world. There's possibility. And I think it's an intensely entangled possibility, which is why I'm always being haunted by old Nicholas of Cusa and his divine complicatio, the folding together, that is also interpreted as the contraction of all to each. Talk about that more tomorrow.
We could take one last question if someone has one right here.
Thank you again, Dr. Keller, for coming. Andrew Doss, third year Divinity student. I am curious about if you would be able to define what is so distinctive, aside from, or maybe it is centrally in catastrophe, but what else might be so distinctive about this moment of crisis from so many others since Paul and in particular, if there's this messianic moment potential, especially with a new public, where is that public venue in a time of such anti-institutionalism?
Oh, huge questions. Thank you, Andrew. Let me fail to answer them. It seems really important to me not to understand this crisis as a total exception. There have been crises, there have been unbearable, horrendous crises. Worlds have ended over and over for multiple populations, and not all of them human. Right? So, crisis, catastrophe levels of crisis is just a part of our planetary history. But we do, as a species, at least occasionally work on that and attempt to mitigate the worst aspects of crisis. We do hope to evolve, some of us, some of the time. And that evolution is proving right now to be very disappointing. We're experiencing right now the collapsibility, I don't know if it's the collapse, of the balance of powers that make our democracy work as well as it has worked. So there's something that might be unprecedented going on in the United States that other political analysts are much more equipped to pin down than I am, but we're facing into the threat here to democracy itself, and it's all the more worrisome since it's apparently part of an international tendency. And again, international movements have happened like this. It's very helpful to look at Hannah Arendt, an essay on the new fascist, it's an essay on the fascist international. It's published like in 1943, and she's already worried about a new one. And it's weird, she actually says that it'll be brought on by immigrants, crises of immigration, and she uses a phrase that's getting translated, I haven't found the German yet, as white supremacism as part of this. So that spooked me out a little bit. But her point about the fascist international then, that she was just seeing the fall of, is that it was international. It blamed the Jews on internationalism, on cosmopolitanism, the protocols, the elders of Zion, Jewish conspiracy. But she said these fascisms, though they worked nationalism to the gills, were actually also they were the international conspiracy. They were working internationally. That's, I think, helpful right now to look at as well, that this hyper-nationalism going on here and in Brexit, and in France, India, is actually quite international. And the ways in which it is in interaction with the particular cosmopolitanism of neoliberal global economics also needs analysis, needs the analysis that Professor Tanner has already done in her Giffords, and probably needs twisting to look at what's happening in the force of the reaction against it, which is what Polanyi was warning about, that if capitalism globalized in a certain direction that would create modernizations and economic inequities that would finally bring on a new fascist reaction. So, not a totally unique moment, but the replications are frightening, and as I think I tried to begin this meditation, we already didn't have time. We already are on the brink of a kind of terminal emergency for human civilization, an emergency that is trying to provoke the emergence of the ecozoic, whose representatives have appeared, is trying to, and we're being badly delayed. by this new round of emergency. I think that's all I want to say right now. I'll think more about the ecological frame tomorrow. So the point is not to get caught up in a kind of degraded apocalypticism of mere doom. I'm with you increasingly in honoring the apocalypse. I was a little too bitchy towards John of Patmos in my Apocalypse Now and Then, you know, that 90s feminism. Respecting him more now. But I'll do more of this. I mean, precisely not as a prediction of the end of the world. He doesn't do that. I'm not doing that. But it's a crisis that seems to demand our attention in fresh ways, to require our gifts, which might mean require us to recognize that we have gifts that we didn't even know we had. Charisma.
Thank you very much.